second step in the design thinking approach is the understanding of the stakeholders. And in order to perform this step, a stakeholder research framework is quite helpful. So what you should do in order to get an empathy for the stakeholders is firstly to differentiate your general question into sub-questions. So what are the questions you are interested in which should be answered? The second step is then to think about who could be able to answer this question. So who are the stakeholders who are to be researched in order to answer this question? The third column is that you think about adequate research methods. So how can you get the answers from the stakeholders to your questions? And the fourth optional step would be that you think about what are your assumptions, what the answers of the stakeholders could be. To give you an example of this stakeholder research framework, I take again the example of Stuttgart. So the question is, how can we reduce the number of individual cars in Stuttgart significantly? Then you could differentiate this question into sub-questions. Take the case of default motorists that are commuters which are commuting into Stuttgart from suburban areas by default. So by default, they take their own car. And sub-questions could be, what are the gains of default motorists to use usually their car to come into the city? There must be some gains doing this. The other question could be then, what are the pains for default motorists to do this? So there are some pains which they might perceive or which they don't perceive. But this is an interesting point where alternative mobility solution can come into account. And the third question points also in this direction. What would default motorists into the city perceive as pain relievers? This is just an example for sub-questions. The stakeholders you should focus on are default motorists that are commuters from suburban areas which commute into the city mostly for working reasons and who use by default their car. When you then think about the research question, this could in the first step perhaps done by desk research, because we have a lot of numbers and figures and statistics indicating at least the number of commuters entering the city every day that are in Stuttgart about 600,000, and we know also the location of these commuters. So these are pieces of information you don't have to ask. You can get from you can get from research which has been already done. And then another research method could also be that you perform focus groups in companies where you get employees into these focus groups which talk about these questions. And expected answers could be, so the gains of using their own motorized vehicles is the door-to-door transport, it's the convenience. So individual cars are much more convenient than public transport or other means of transport. the flexibility they have, so they don't have to follow a predefined schedule. And another more economic gain could be the utilization of a car. If you have bought a car, you have to utilize it. Yeah? There's no use in leaving the car idle at home. You have to utilize it. That could be gains or reasons why they use their car. Pains could be that are all assumptions. A long travel time due to congestions, all the unused time you leave in congestions, and also the stress level, especially at peak times when you commute to work. And that might be the points where alternative mobility solutions could come into place and could be then provided as a marketable solution. So no congestion, usable travel time, fast travel, and a seamless mobility solution could be pain relievers for these default motorists. And this is kind of a preparation before you think about methods or getting stakeholders into your research. This is a very helpful preparation in advance in order to do your research quite focused. What you have to do in order to understand the stakeholders, of course, is firstly to identify your stakeholders. With respect to mobility solutions, typical stakeholders are, of course, users, in our case, motorists, which might travel frequently or infrequently, depending on the travel reason. Other stakeholders might also be providers, transport providers, information providers that could be the same stakeholders or different, service providers, and the transport management. Other group of stakeholders which might be interesting are governmental bodies on a country level, on a region level, or community level. So it depends a bit on the structure, how governmental bodies are organized. But this might also be interesting stakeholders. And also private sponsors. They might be public sponsors or private companies which invest into mobility solutions. This is kind of a general checklist for stakeholders for mobility solutions, and of course you have to select them according to your topic and also to specify them accordingly. When you have identified the stakeholders, it might be that multiple stakeholder groups and single stakeholders come into your mind. You can't take them into account altogether very often, and therefore it might be helpful to group them, perhaps according to two criteria: the influence of the stakeholders on the mobility situation, so a very strong influence regarding reducing the level of cars in Stuttgart would be, of course, the motorists, the drivers, but also the providers of alternative solutions. And another criteria would be the influenceability of the stakeholders. And here, the users or the motorists, they differ. So there are certain segments, customer segments or motorist segments. Some are inclined to switch to alternative modes of transport, some aren't. And according to these two criteria, the influenceability and the influence of the stakeholders, you can group your stakeholders so that you can focus on the key players and perhaps on the place stakeholders, but you don't have to investigate all stakeholders. When you have identified and perhaps also categorized your stakeholders, the next step would be to segment your stakeholders. We have two possibilities for stakeholder segmentation, and this is the so-called a priori approach. It's from Latin, so it's an already predefined categorization of users. Or you can also choose a post hoc approach. That means, according to interviews or observations or experiments you have done, you can categorize certain segments of users or motorists according to predefined criteria. Now I'm going to show you some a priori approaches which we find in literature, especially for mobility topics. Quite a lot of segmentation has been done already. This is one example for traveler or commuter segmentation according to two segmentation criteria: the frequency of traveling and if they come from rural areas or if they live in the city. And according to these two criteria, you can then segment, for example, as I mentioned it already, the default motorists, which are frequent travelers, which come at least from suburban areas of the city and commuting into the city every day and use their car by default. We have progressive metropolits, which live in the city and which are not so dependent on individual cars because they have a lot of possibilities to use other means of transport. The same are urban riders. They differ from progressive metropolites in that they commute infrequently because they do a lot of home office or whatever. We have dependent passengers, which are also traveling infrequently for shopping reasons and which come from suburban areas, and they, as the title indicates it, they are dependent on their own car because they lack other means of transport. And we have rural drivers, which come from rural areas into the city and use their car. And for these segments, we have different needs. And this is very important because if you develop a solution, a mobility solution, you have to keep in mind who your customers are. And you can't address all the customers which have different need in the same way, but you have to focus on them. And this is the whole intention behind segmentation of travelers here. Another segmentation, also taken from literature, they have very nice names like die-hard drivers or carless crusaders. They are segmented according to the frequency of leisure day trips undertaken by alternative transport modes in the past and intentions to use alternatives in the future. And then you can see here we have a segment which are called die-hard drivers, which haven't used any alternatives in the past and won't use them in the future. So you won't get them switch from their car to other means of transport by no means of marketing. Here you have to use governance solutions, so political solutions, restrictions. Then we have carless crusaders, which for different reasons, always have used alternative modes of transport and will use in the future alternative modes of transport for environmental protection reasons, or other reasons. So here you don't have to address them because they are using other means of transport anyway. And therefore, in order to lower the number of cars in Stuttgart, you have to focus on all the segments which are in between of these extreme points. So reluctant riders, so they use their car, but they are not very happy to use their car, or aspiring environmentalists, which also usually use their car, but which are not very happy because of environmental concerns, or malcontented motorists, so they don't care much about the environment, but they are not very content due to the congestion rate or to the long time finding a parking space, things like that. And these exactly are then the user groups you have to address by addressing their special needs, and offering them good alternative which points directly to the pain points they have in using their own cars. And this is the marketing approach to mobility solutions. Regarding the needs they have, they are quite common when we view the needs of travelers or commuters from a very general point of view. It's always what people want is proximity, so short or no walks. They need travel services on demand, so with no long waiting times. They need travel services point to point directly, yeah, not with multiple switches where you miss then one vehicle and then you have to wait for a long time. Then another typical need is short travel time, convenience or comfort, safety, especially in lower developed countries, and also the price issue is an issue. The difference with the different stakeholder segments is they have different priorities. There are some user segments which would choose convenience over timeliness or proximity. Other user segments, for them safety is more important, and we have user segments, they say, I take everything into account, every inconvenience, but for me the most important point is that it's a low cost means of transport. So they differ from each other with respect to the preferences they have. And this is exactly what has to be done when you segment users, that you segment them according to the different needs. And then you can devise mobility solution which addresses exactly the different needs of them. So that's the system how the marketing of mobility solution works usually. And now you can think of the different user segments. I showed you two possibilities to segment users or motorists, and you can think of which segment has which preference for their travel behavior. So what preferences might have default motorists? What preferences might have the carless crusaders? And then you characterize, you specify your user segments. think of that, and we will discuss it then in our MS Teams session. So the next question is then, what are possible methods in order to understand the stakeholder needs a bit better? And here we have the same possibilities you might already know from research methods. So I call them data collection methods. The first means, because it's the cheapest one with the lowest effort, is desk research. Before you go and ask users what they want and what they need, do desk research. Be informed how many motorists or users do we have, from where to where are they commuting. This is all information you get usually from desk research, that means from Google mostly. Only for these questions where you don't get any answers from desk research, use primary research. And this is a kind of research which costs a lot of effort, and therefore it should be focused on questions where you didn't get any answer by desk research. And the typical methods for primary research are interviews. This is taken very often. So I don't know any topic where interviews haven't been conducted yet. They could be done oral or written. That's clear. With different sub-methods, but I don't go into these details now. What is a road less traveled are observations. Observations, they disclose other pieces of information you don't get by interviews. That means the real behavior of the people. Because what people say in interviews and what they do is very often very different. And therefore, observation costs a lot of time, but they disclose a lot of information you don't get by interviews. And this can be classified into field observations, or laboratory observations, but mostly field observations are used. Or you do experiments, that you and you can also do field experiments in that you say, okay, they get a few cities do that now, that they make public transport free, and the experiment is the price one of the factors which influence the usage of public transport? Because if they make public transport free, then a lot of people should switch. That is the hypothesis, and they try to validate this hypothesis by an experiment. That are the usual data collection methods, but in the design thinking approach, there is a kind of priority which methods are usually employed. So what's usually done, as I mentioned it, are interviews. What you get by interviews is what people say and think, what they wanted. So this is very influenced by a social behavior they want to display, and it's explicit knowledge. A kind of a deeper technique or deeper method in order to come to user behavior and user needs are observations. And as I mentioned it already, there might be a big difference between what people say and what they do. And they might even see what they do, especially with respect to sustainability. When you do interviews on sustainability, everybody says, sustainability is very important to me. It's important to me in all aspects of my life, and so on. If you observe the same people, what they do, you get a completely different picture. And therefore, my recommendation is to switch more to observations, because there you can really observe the behavior of people. And even more deeper level are generative sessions where you invite customers or users to think about alternative solutions to solve a problem, like bringing down the number of cars in Stuttgart. If you do generative sessions with them, you get to the point what people envision, what they feel, what they dream about. So you come to the level of latent knowledge. So the methods which are employed in design thinking, in product development, they have developed more and more from interviews now to generative sessions, lead user workshops, and so on, where you, with the aim that you get to the real needs, even to the needs they are not aware of. And this is just one hint for you to think about the methods. What do I want to get? Do I want to get what people say? Or do I want to know more about the behavior, or more about the real needs which they even are not aware of? And according to this research intention, to your research goal, you should choose the method which is adequate for that. And here then are some recommendations for doing interviews, observations, or generative sessions. You know them already, and you get more detailed information about this in other sessions, especially research methodology lectures. The next point is, how do I document what I got from my user research? And there are different methods in order to document that. One of the very common methods which is used in design thinking is the empathy map. Here you create a persona which is kind of a representative for a certain user segment. In this case, it's Jeff. And to document what did Jeff say, yeah, like public transport is too uncomfortable, is too expensive, is too time consuming. What does Jeff do according to your observation or according to what he said? He uses always his private car into the city because it's very convenient, because he can do his shopping on the way home. He can also use the car in order to drop his kids on the way to work. And since he uses the car all the time, they need a second car because they live in rural areas, in suburban areas, outside the city, and therefore his wife needs also a car. This is what he does. What he thinks is not public transport is too expensive or too uncomfortable, but he thinks I need flexibility, and public transport doesn't offer me the level of flexibility I need. I need more comfort. I need to save time, whatever, or to save money. And the art of doing good research or good stakeholder understanding is that you come, even in an interview, from the say level to the think and feel level. What are the real needs behind what Jeff says? Yeah? Flexibility, independence, comfort could be also attained by other means of transport than by using his own car. Or if he has preferences, like the preferences of flexibility, you really can't beat the car with other means of transport, but you perhaps can beat the using the car with respect to comfortability. Perhaps you can devise a mobility solution which is more comfortable, and by addressing this, you can get Jeff switching to other modes of transport. So this is one method in order to document what you have collected the information collected from your stakeholder research. Because Jeff has also pains this and gains. You can see here in the last two sections the waste of time in congestions, the unused vehicle at home, the waste of money because having two cars costs money. That are the pain points. And here, these are the points you can use as a starting point for developing alternative mobility solutions. Yeah. Another means of transport is a value proposition analysis. And here, what you do here is that you list the customer jobs. So what has a commuter to do from leaving his or her home till coming back from work? You list the jobs and you try to find out, in doing these jobs, these mobility jobs, what are the gains, the perceived gains of the commuter, what are the pains. And according to the perceived gains and pains of the commuter, you can create a mobility solution, meaning products and services, which contain gain creators, so addresses all the things which a commuter feels as being a benefit of using his own car, for example. And you can also address pain relievers. So this is another method of documenting what you have found out in your stakeholder research. You document it on the right side. And then in the ideation phase, you can use this, you can complement this by developing a solution which addresses the gains and the pains of the customer. So this is a kind of checklist. So what is meant by gains and pains and what are possible customer jobs. So you get an impression what is demanded here on the right-hand side of our value proposition analysis. The key messages for understanding stakeholders for doing this phase of the design thinking cycle is that you first of all identify the stakeholders and with the emphasis on relevant stakeholders. That are the users, of course, but that might be also the providers, the supporters, the sponsors. Secondly, if you have your main stakeholders, you have to segment especially the users according to the requirements, the preferences, the needs, the behavior they have. And here I introduce the a priori segmentation, which you can derive from literature, or if it's not available in literature, you can do a post hoc segmentation, doing the interviews and segmenting your user groups according to your interviews. Then you have to choose the research methods. And my hint was to use research methods where you can get to the level of needs of customers, not what they say, but rather how they behave and what their needs and dreams are. And this secures then the quality of your mobility solution that is real marketable. The result of the stakeholder research may be documented either in an empathy map, I showed you that, or second possibility would be a value proposition analysis. There are only two methods for documenting it, and both you can then use in the next phase, which is the ideation phase, where you ideate solutions and evaluate them. Thank you very much.